Hello everyone. I'm excited to do some social studies with you today. We haven't done social studies in quite some time. January is an important month and we celebrate a holiday called Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We're going to talk a little bit more about Martin Luther King Jr. Next week, but this week to start off our topic, I wanted to talk about an important first grader. We are going to talk about a girl named Ruby Bridges today. Ruby Bridges was a first grader who grew up during the time of Martin Luther King Jr. when schools were separated based on what people looked like. Okay, so we're gonna learn a little bit more about this amazing first grader, just like you all are, and then we're gonna talk about how we would describe her character and some character traits of Ruby Bridges. So be thinking of that while I'm reading, okay? The story of Ruby Bridges. Our Ruby taught us all a lot. She became someone who helped change our country. She was part of history, just like generals and presidents are part of history. They're leaders, and so was Ruby. She led us away from hate, and she led us nearer to knowing each other, the white folks and the black folks. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. We were very, very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops and we just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick crops, so my daddy lost his job and that's when we had to move. I remember us moving. I was 4. In 1957, a family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of children during the day, and after they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. Ruby's mother wanted her children to grow up strong. At the time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonell, 19, and 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to first grade in the William Frantz Elementary School, all by herself. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in such an important event in American history. They went to church. On Ruby's first day of school, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the Frantz Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. Every day for weeks and turned into months, Ruby experienced that same kind of school day. She walked to the Frantz school surrounded by marshals, wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch bag. Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. Could you imagine if that's how you got dropped off at school every day? How do you think Ruby's feeling? How would you describe her here? The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There was no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with her and learn with her and eat lunch with her. But every day, Ruby went to the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked hard, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there and she didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child had ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom in an empty building. Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry, how she went by those mobs and sat there all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really afraid or though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep being so relaxed and hopeful, and if she'd gradually start to wear down or even decide she didn't want to go to school anymore. then one morning something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by the window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women, and she seemed to be talking to them. Would you talk to all these people screaming and yelling at you? I don't know. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed very angry. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into school. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby she'd been watching and was surprised that Ruby stopped and talked with the people. Ruby became irritated. I didn't stop and talk with them, she said. Ruby, I saw you talking, Mrs. Henry said. I saw your lips moving. I wasn't talking, said Ruby. I was praying. I was praying for them. Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. She walked a few blocks in the crowd behind her. Ruby said a prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. Forgive these people, because even if they say bad things, they don't know what they're doing. Please forgive them like you did the folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you. The end. Later that year, two white boys joined Ruby at the France Elementary School. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school learning. The mob became very angry when the first white students went back to school, but the boys were soon joined by other children. We've been sitting back and let our children get cheated out of education because some people have tried to take the law into their own hands. It's time for us to fight on the side of the law and for our children's right to go to school and get education. They did get their education, and Ruby and a growing number of other children went to school with her. By this time, Ruby was in 2nd grade, and the mobs had given up trying to scare Ruby and defeat the judge's order of New Orleans schools being desegregated so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. Year after year, Ruby went to the France school, and she graduated from it and went on to graduate from high school. The end. So, if you ever think that a 1st grader can't make a difference or be a leader, remember Ruby Bridges, because you absolutely can. She paved the way for all children who didn't look like one of the white children that typically went to school, and allowed them all to get the education that they deserve. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Ruby Bridges' character and some character traits that we could describe for her. So I'm going to get you started. Ruby was definitely very brave or courageous, right? She was walking into the school building all by herself, even when all those people were yelling and trying to stop her. I'm going to say she was determined. We talked about this word in school before. It's a big word, but determined means that you don't give up, right? She kept going back to school every day, even though she was the only one there. She kept trying to learn new things, even though going to school was a little bit scary and new and different, right? And I might say that she was smart, right? She cared about her education and learning. Okay, so I've started you with 3 character traits, and I want you to come up with at least 3 more. You could come up with more if you want, and you're going to write them down on your paper and post it to Seesaw. You can also color in the picture of Ruby Bridges if you'd like. All right, friends, try your best.